So when I go to make waffles, over the years I've, probably changed it several times. I always keep in mind a basic recipe that I used to use, but basically you need equal amounts of liquid and dry materials. And remember, it's chemistry, right? When you combine the things, then you get the reaction, the chemical reaction. So thinking about that, I like to always there's some things I do the same way all the time, and that is I always put the dry into the wet, not the other way around. And I generally add the dry 1/2 measure at a time so that it blends together more easily. You're more likely to get it mixed sooner, and you don't want to overwork a batter. You never want to overdo it because that makes a batter tough. So if there's some lumps in it when you mix the wet and the dry together, that's okay as long as the majority of it is mixed up. So just think of that. You don't want to overdo it. So you got your dry ingredients. You have to have salt as one of the chemical ingredients, right? Salt, baking powder, and baking soda. I use the two because that was the recipe I started with. I think you can actually just use baking powder because baking soda is part of baking powder. So you have to have salt, baking powder, baking soda, your liquid, which is milk, and depending on how, again, I don't think I make it exactly the same way every time. Depending on how light or how hearty you want the waffles, you can either use 2 eggs and whole milk for a heartier mix, or you can use non-fat milk and 1 egg yolk. And remember, you're separating the egg. You're using the whole egg, but you're going to separate the egg whites at the beginning and beat that up to a pretty stiff consistency. Not real dry, what they call real dry, but not real wet. The way I test it usually is I beat up my egg whites and then tip the bowl, and if it stays in the bowl, that's stiff enough, okay? If it wants to come out of the bowl, then you need to beat it a little bit more, but don't beat it to the point where it's too dry, because then it doesn't blend well with the batter. So your milk, your eggs, your vanilla in one bowl, the flour, the salt, the baking soda, baking powder in another bowl, and I just mix that with a fork just to blend it first, and then I'll beat the eggs and the milk and the vanilla together to get them blended, and then half of that dry mixture in, mix it again until it's pretty well mixed, but again, not overdoing it, and then the rest of the dry, you put that in. So the last thing, and the oil, I forgot to mention the oil. Once you get the dry and the liquid mixed together well, then I add my oil, and about a 1/3 cup. Some recipes call for a quarter, some call for as much as a 1/2 cup. I use a 1/3 cup of oil. And you can also do it with melted butter in place of the oil. I use canola oil, but I've seen recipes that use melted butter, and that makes a very rich waffle, and it's darker when you bake it because butter tends to turn brown, so you have a darker waffle. But when you use melted butter, you have to remember to use warm milk, because if you use cold milk, what's going to happen? The butter's going to solidify, and you don't want that. You want a nice cohesive mix. So if you're going to use melted butter in place of the oil, then make sure that the milk is warm. Okay, and then you put all those ingredients together, and the last thing you do is fold in the egg whites. Don't beat them in, because the idea is to entrap the air in the batter so that you have a nice light waffle. And then when you put it in the waffle iron, again, I use medium to medium high temperature on the iron, and general rule is 3 minutes, but all irons are a little bit different. So you're going to have to kind of test the first one and see if it's underdone or overdone, and then add a little bit of time. I've seen it written that the way to tell if the waffle's done is wait until it stops steaming. Well, I think if you wait until it stops steaming completely, it's going to be overdone. So I would say put your waffle batter in, don't fill the iron quite full, because it tends to expand, or else it's all going to dribble out the sides, and nobody wants that. And then watch the steam. The majority of the steam is going to happen during the cooking process. Once it gets down to very little, it's going to be about 2.5 to 3 minutes. And then open your iron up and pull it out. depending on the iron, sometimes you have to oil it pretty well. You have to coat it with oil to keep them from sticking. If you have a good Teflon coated iron, that's not as necessary. And if you use a blend of, if you really want to get creative, you can blend butter, melted butter and oil together and coat the iron, and then put your batter in there, which has butter in it also, and you'll get a real rich waffle.